Once upon a time, there was a man named Patrick who lived with his family in the large city of Chisamba. Patrick's family was wealthy and accomplished, and this was a subject of admiration throughout the city. Patrick had 2 daughters. One of his daughters was named Elena, whom he had with his current wife. His second daughter was named Imani, the child from his previous marriage. Patrick's overwhelming love for his daughter Elena led him to fulfill all her needs and even her greatest whims. In contrast, Imani was often forgotten and received no love from her father. Patrick did not like Imani's mother and had divorced her. He always thought Imani was not his biological daughter. To Patrick, his wife had cheated on him, and this is where his excessive hatred for Imani originated. Elena's mother also hated Imani because she found her more beautiful than her daughter Elena. Thus, Imani lived in a family where no one loved her. Patrick owned one of the largest and most beautiful houses in the entire city. His businesses were extremely successful. His daughter Imani, who was 22 years old, was 3 years older than Elena. Despite being poorly fed or spending entire days without eating, her daily life was filled with household chores that she performed diligently and earnestly. In contrast, Elena was a mischievous girl. She was not a homebody and loved to have fun. Her days were filled with outings to clubs and nightclubs. One Sunday evening, while Elena was out at a nightclub smoking and causing trouble in an illegal place, the police raided the nightclub and arrested a large number of people, including herself. The news reached her parents, who were frantic with worry. Patrick was ready to do anything to ensure his daughter's freedom if there was a chance for her. He went to see the officer, and after a discussion, the officer, corrupt as he was, confessed that he could replace his daughter with another person. Otherwise, there would be no other outcome until they went to court. Patrick, somewhat relieved and excited at the idea of having a chance with the officer, quickly agreed and went home to convince his daughter Imani to take Elena's place. Once home, Patrick told Imani that when she got out of prison, he promised to treat her well and enroll her in university. This brightened Imani's face, who shed tears of joy without realizing it, because every time she knelt to pray, she cried for her father's love. She quickly accepted the offer, not suspecting the worst experience that awaited her. After the successful exchange, Elena's mother danced in the shadows at the thought of finally getting rid of Imani. Once in prison, Imani found herself in the same cell as an elderly woman named Nathalie. The latter was often sick and frequently had fits due to the intense heat in the prison. Imani had always been a kind-hearted girl, always with a radiant smile and a love for the simple things in life. Her nature made her feel so bad for the sick woman that she often helped her in prison. Nathalie always received a visitor named Kevin. Kevin was her only son. Kevin was a very classy and handsome man. Every time he came to the prison, Imani would watch him endlessly. She found him very handsome, and deep down she was in love with him. But being very reserved, she had never made it known. She had never even told Mrs. Nathalie. Nathalie was accused of her husband's murder, which had landed her in prison. After several years in this cell, she was serving a sentence of which she did not know the true details. Kevin, her son, had tried every means to free her, but to no avail. However, she had only 3 months left to serve, unlike Imani, who had no visitors, no lawyer, no family. She had already been in the cell for several weeks. Since her arrival, Nathalie no longer felt as alone as before. Imani respected her greatly and cared for her, which brought great inner peace to Nathalie. One day, while they were talking, Nathalie's curiosity led her to ask Imani what crime had brought her to prison. Great was her surprise when she learned that Imani had committed no crime. If there was indeed a crime, it was her quest for her father's love, her sister's love, and her stepmother's love. Touched, Nathalie resolved to help her once she was free by pleading her case with her son. Imani had never expected any help, least of all from this lady. She was flooded with joy and hope. A tear escaped from her eyes in spite of herself. A few days later, while Imani was sleeping in her cell, one of the prison guards came to tell her that she had a visitor. A visitor? She wondered in surprise. Imani went to see the visitor, and to her surprise, it was her father. He had come with the idea of fooling his daughter again for her benefit. When Imani saw her father, she was overjoyed and wanted to hug him, but to her surprise, she was rejected by her father. "You smell bad," he shouted in her face. He then explained that she had a chance of getting out of prison if she did what he asked. Patrick's biggest business was in danger, and if he didn't manage to sign a deal with the richest man in town, his company might close down altogether. The wealthy man had asked Patrick to give him a daughter to satisfy his sexual desires, so that, in return, he would marry his second daughter, Elena, making him and Elena business partners. This would allow Patrick to grow his business. At the police station, Patrick asks Imani to sleep with the man. Imani was still a virgin and had therefore never been touched by a man until her father spoke to her. She automatically refused her father's proposal, as her femininity and virginity were dear to her. After many tricks by Patrick, who made her understand that it was the only way for her to get out of that cell, he argued that he would get enough money from the rich man, and that the money would be used to free her from prison, which was not true. Imani finally fell into this new trap set by her father. In the evening of that day, a very nice car came to pick up Imani and take her to the hotel room where she was supposed to meet the so-called rich man. When she arrived at the room, darkness was everywhere. Not wanting to be recognized, the man spoke in a different tone, since he was a very wealthy and influential person in town. He asked poor Imani to undress, which she did, crying. The strange voice asked her to climb onto the bed, even though she couldn't see anything. She did as she was told. The man, carried away by his intense desire, quickly climbed onto the bed and entered her unprotected and deviated. The room was dark. Imani couldn't see the man's face. The man couldn't see her either, but he didn't care. His only aim was to satisfy his desires. When he had finished satisfying his desires by taking advantage of Imani, he called his driver to take her back to the place where he had towed her. Imani returned to the prison all sad. As for the man, he slept in the hotel that night. When he woke up the next morning, he noticed a bloodstain on the bed, and that's when he realized that Imani was a virgin. Why would Patrick bring me a virgin girl when he could just find me a girl easily on the street? His head heavy with guilt, he quickly got into his car and left the hotel without even brushing or washing. Since that night, Imani had felt increasingly unhappy. Nathalie, who knew her as a very cheerful and jovial girl, soon noticed. When she asked her if she was all right, she always said yes, even though she suffered in silence every time she remembered that she'd just lost her virginity so easily to someone she didn't even know. "I know you're worried because you're in prison, but in 2 weeks I'll be released, and I'll do everything in my power to get you out of here too," added Nathalie. It's been 2 weeks since Imani did what her father asked her to do. But since then she's been in prison, and her father hasn't even thought of visiting her once. Eventually, she realized that her father had once again used and abandoned her, as was his wont. Meanwhile, Patrick was already showing the best wedding dresses to his daughter Elena. She was very happy and already imagining the beautiful life ahead with the rich man. The next day, Kevin came to accompany his mother home. She had finished serving her full sentence and could now go home. Imani was very happy for her, but she started to cry again because the only person who was close to her, the person she considered her mother, was leaving. Madame Nathalie came to her and wiped away her tears. "I'll do everything in my power to get you out of here by the end of the week." She then gave him her address before leaving. When she arrived home, Madame Nathalie begged her son to do something for Imani. Kevin wasn't expecting it, but since it was coming from his mother, he quickly agreed to do something for Imani. As he was friends with several police officers, he made several calls to negotiate Imani's release. Within a day, Imani was released. She immediately returned home to her parents. Patrick was eating at the table with his wife and daughter Elena when she entered the room. Her physical state and the strong smell she gave off took away their appetite. Patrick then asked her, "Have you been released, or have you escaped from prison?" Imani replied, "The lady who was in the same cell as me at the prison was released about a week ago, and as soon as she got out, she arranged for me to be released too." Patrick barely listened to Imani's words. He didn't care. "You're not welcome here in my house. Go back quietly to the place you left." Imani couldn't believe his ears. How can someone who says he's my father behave like this with me? Am I really his daughter? What have I done to deserve all this hatred? She began to cry loudly, feeling betrayed and used. She wiped her tears away and looked at Nathalie's address in her pocket. She had thought of going to her house, asking her to employ her to work from home so she could find a place to sleep. She left her father's house and went to Nathalie's address. When she got there, the guards at the door refused to let her into the house because she was in a rather dirty state. She had just left prison. She turned to leave when Kevin, Nathalie's son, arrived in front of the house with his car. She greeted Kevin politely, and he asked her what she was looking for. Imani replied that she had come to thank Madame Nathalie for helping her out of prison. "No, you don't need to thank her, don't worry." Imani knew that if she ever left, she was screwed because she didn't know where to sleep, and she had nowhere else to go. "In fact, I'd really like to see her, sir, even if it's for the last time," continued Imani. Kevin realized that there was no point in prolonging the discussion because he risked wasting time unnecessarily. He motioned to one of the house guards to let Imani in, which he did. The guard accompanied Imani. When Imani entered the house, her mouth dropped open. The house was so pretty, so clean, so beautiful. She looked all around her. Nathalie, who could see her through the window, called her name. She came out of her dream. She went to greet Nathalie. She was really shocked because in prison, Nathalie was so humble and acted as if she was poor and had never behaved like a rich person. She could never imagine owning such a big house. "Come on, you can come into the bedroom," Nathalie said. Imani followed Madame Nathalie into her room, and forgetting that she had come to ask for a job, she began to talk about Nathalie's house. "Your house is really incredible, Madame. I've never been in such a beautiful house in my life." But Madame Nathalie didn't like people talking about her wealth or her house, so she quickly cut Imani off and asked if she wanted something to eat. Imani, who was very hungry because she'd just left prison, replied, "Whatever you like, Madame." Nathalie quickly called the cook to prepare something for her guest. "Can you tell me a little about your family?" asked Nathalie. It was then that she remembered why she had come to Nathalie. Sadness quickly invaded her face. "What's wrong?" asked Nathalie. Imani replied sadly that she was looking for a place to sleep and needed a job. "As soon as I got out of prison, I went home, but my parents kicked me out. I don't know where to go, and if I leave now, I might end up sleeping in the street." Nathalie remembered all the things she'd done to her when she was in prison. "You're like a daughter to me, Imani. You can stay in the house as long as you like. I don't mind." Imani immediately replied, "I don't want to just stay here and enjoy your possessions, madame. If I could work for you here, I wouldn't have to stay at home and do nothing." Nathalie had known Imani in prison as a very wise girl, so she didn't hesitate to let her work as her housekeeper. She promised her a very good salary. That same day, Nathalie, who had noticed that Imani wasn't well dressed and didn't have many clothes, decided to change her wardrobe. The first day went very well for Imani, who was already used to working and cleaning at home. In the evening, Kevin returned from work and pressed the buzzer. Nathalie sent Imani to open the door for him. As she went to open the door for Kevin, a wind blew through her hair and it began to fly in the air. Imani's beautiful breasts and curves showed through the tight dress she was wearing. Kevin was speechless. In his mind, he thought, "Wow, what a beautiful woman. She clearly has it all." He continued to gaze at Imani's curves until her greeting brought him back down to earth. "Good evening, madam. Who are you, please?" She answered, "I'm Imani, the girl you helped get out of prison, the same one you met this morning." Kevin was surprised to see that the same dirty Imani he'd met in the morning had become so beautiful. "What are you still doing here? I thought you were supposed to greet my mother and leave." Nathalie, who was listening to them, quickly went outside to answer her son. "She's my cleaning lady. I employed her." Kevin called his mother from across the room and asked her if she had studied this girl before employing her in their house. "I've only known this girl in prison. Are you sure she's wise and honest enough to work in our house?" But Nathalie immediately replied, "Don't worry, my son. I know this girl well. Don't worry." Kevin loved his mother so much that he didn't contradict her. The next morning, Imani was already busy with her chores when the house bell rang. She went to open the door. It was Nathalie's personal doctor. He had come with bad news. "Hello, madam. I've brought the results of the tests we ran recently, but the news isn't good." "Go ahead, sir. Tell me everything. I'm listening anyway." Unfortunately, it turns out that Nathalie had a completely damaged kidney, and the only kidney that was still alive was not in good condition. "We need to get you a kidney transplant as soon as possible, madam. Otherwise, you risk the worst." Her son Kevin offered to give her his kidney. But once the tests had been carried out, the results revealed that Kevin's kidney could not be transplanted into Nathalie because their blood types didn't match. Nathalie was very sad, but she didn't worry, telling herself that even if she died, Imani would take care of her son. Nathalie's last wish was for Imani to marry her son Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin continued to contact other hospitals to try and find a compatible kidney for his mother. He didn't want to lose his mother so easily, as he never had the opportunity to spend much time with her. As a child, Nathalie had been abducted, and he had spent most of his childhood without his mother's love. He didn't want to lose her now that they had the opportunity to be together. When Imani learned that Nathalie hadn't found a compatible kidney, she was really sad. She went to see Kevin and offered to donate her kidney to Madame Nathalie. Kevin was surprised by Imani's kindness. Without further explanation, he took Imani to the hospital to check the compatibility of her kidney, because his one and only concern was to save his mother, no matter what. Unfortunately, after the tests, the doctor again revealed that Imani's kidney was not compatible with Nathalie's kidney either. Kevin returned home with Imani with a grandiose sadness. Once home, Imani rushed to see Nathalie on her bed. Kevin followed her too. She stayed by her side, crying. "Unfortunately, my kidney isn't compatible with yours either, Madame Nathalie. I'm so sorry." Madame Nathalie said to herself that there was no chance of her living. It was as if fate was against her. No compatible kidney had yet been found to perform the transplant. It was at this point that she decided to tell her son what was in her heart, because she didn't know how long she would live. "My son, you know I'm closer than ever to the end. But I want you to make me a promise now." "What promise, Mom?" her son asked. "I want you to marry Imani and make her your wife. That's my last wish." Imani was very surprised by Nathalie's announcement. Kevin refused. "Imani is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, but I can't damage my honor and reputation by marrying a cleaning lady." Nathalie tried to convince him again. "If you don't grant this wish that's so dear to me, even if a kidney were to be found for me tomorrow, I'd refuse the transplant." Kevin was at a loss for words. What was he going to do in this situation? He loved his mother so much and would do anything for her. He didn't want his mother to leave him so soon, least of all because of himself. He didn't know what decision to make. But knowing that his mother's life was in danger, he agreed to marry Imani. Nathalie was overjoyed. The next day, Kevin called Imani and gave her some papers to sign. When she read the papers, she noticed it was a marriage contract. She was very happy inside, but she didn't let it show. Kevin then began to explain to her that he had already made a promise to one person that he would marry her. But Imani, who was in a hurry to go and take care of Nathalie, didn't have time to listen to his explanations. That evening, Kevin and Imani went to see Nathalie. Nathalie told them they were to be married tomorrow. "But why are you in such a hurry, Mom?" asked Kevin. "I want you to get married as soon as possible, because I don't know how much longer I have to live, and I'm getting worse every day. I don't want to die without knowing for sure that you've already married." Kevin, who didn't want to see his mother unhappy, immediately went to the courthouse to ask for a wedding as a matter of urgency. He didn't want to invite people over to his house. Once Kevin's request had been approved by the court, Nathalie bought Imani a beautiful dress and dressed her herself. Kevin also got dressed and they went to court together. A few hours later, they were already married. The newlywed couple returned home with Nathalie, who was now in a wheelchair. After their wedding, Imani continued to sleep in her maid's room. But Nathalie called to tell her she had to move her things into her husband's room. "You're married now. You're his wife from now on, so take your things and move into his room." Kevin wondered how he was going to live with a cleaning lady in his room. He was disinterested. He let Imani sleep on the chair or on a mat while he slept on the bed. A few days later, Nathalie's health had completely deteriorated. Imani was alone with her at home. Aware that something had to be done quickly, she took her to the hospital before calling Kevin. Kevin, who was at the office, quickly went to the hospital. The doctor announced that unfortunately, Madame Nathalie would die in a few hours if her kidney was not changed. Kevin had done everything he could to contact several hospitals, but he hadn't found a donor. The only person Kevin had found was a 5-hour drive from the hospital. She was a woman to whom Kevin had promised a lot of money if she agreed to donate her kidney. But the amount Kevin offered wasn't enough. Kevin called the woman back and promised her double the amount he had offered. This time, the woman agreed. Madame Nathalie called her son to make one last request. "Kevin, promise me that you and Imani will support each other, and that you'll name your first child after me if it's a girl. Mom, "Stop talking and get some rest, because the donor's already on his way," replied Kevin, cleverly dodging her question. Unfortunately, by the time the lady who was to donate her kidney arrived at the hospital, it was already too late. Madame Nathalie had already passed away. Kevin was devastated, weeping bitterly. He had lost everything. Imani, shocked by the news, fainted and was immediately attended to by the doctors on the scene. When she awoke, she continued to cry. Nathalie was like a mother to her. She had been abandoned by her family. Nathalie was her only comfort. She did everything with her and began to be very close to her. Fate was against her. The doctors on the scene ran tests on her when she fainted. They brought the test results to Kevin. "Sir, your wife needs a lot of rest because of her condition. You've got to make sure she rests and doesn't get too sad because it's not good for her, and it's not good for her baby either." "Her baby?" asked Kevin, completely stunned. "Yes, sir, your wife is pregnant," replied the doctor. Kevin, who had been mourning the loss of his mother, was now raging with anger. "I knew that girl was a whore," he said, sad and disappointed at the same time. "I knew that girl was a whore. But the one thing I never imagined was that she was pregnant by another man when she was supposed to be my wife. I thought she was honest. She was just fooling us with her good face. I'd warned my mother," Kevin thought inwardly. He got into his car and left the hospital in an indescribable state. He didn't even think of taking Imani home. A few hours later, Imani came to her senses and asked the doctors for permission to go home. A few weeks later, Nathalie was buried in the presence of her son Kevin, her friends and Imani. As for Imani, she stayed at Nathalie's grave and cried for hours. When she finally came home, Kevin was already waiting for her in the living room. "Our contract is finished. You can now go back to where you came from. After all, you're a street girl, an unscrupulous whore. I'll give you some money to get by, but that's it. I don't want to see you here anymore. How can you get pregnant when you're married to me, and I've never touched you? How can you? What excuse can you give for it? You're a whore. I knew it." Imani began to deny the pregnancy. "But I'm not pregnant, Monsieur Kevin," she replied. "Stop talking bullshit and see for yourself." Kevin handed her the papers written by the doctors. When Imani read the papers, she started to cry because she herself didn't know. Kevin continued to ask her questions. "Who is the father of your child?" Imani couldn't give an answer. She wasn't capable of it. "So you've actually slept with several men, and now you don't know who the father of your child is? I was beginning to like you, to love you. But now you've proved to me that women like you are never to be trusted. I was really starting to feel something for you, but now I hate you. I hate you," said Kevin. He went to his car, took out the divorce papers and handed them to Imani. As soon as she signed the papers, Kevin chased her out of the house. Imani was distraught. She cried outside alone. She was asking herself lots of questions. Where am I going to go now? My father disowned me. He used me several times before leaving me to my own devices. The only person who understands me is no longer with us. And now I'm pregnant by a man I don't know, a man whose face I've never even seen. She then went to Nathalie's grave. She slept there for 3 days, crying all the time, even though she was pregnant. She also prayed day and night, asking God for help. She had no one to confide in. After 3 days of sleeping there, she found an unfinished building and took refuge from the cold night air. Meanwhile, Kevin was haunted all the time, as he kept thinking of all the care Imani had given his mother when he was away. If Imani hadn't been with Nathalie, she might even have died in prison. He began to question himself. He was beginning to understand that he'd done something very wrong. Even if Imani had cheated on him with another man, he couldn't leave her alone to fend for herself in her condition. It was as if he'd forgotten everything she'd done for his mother. He got up abruptly, took his car and went in search of Imani. He went to his mother's grave because he knew Imani would be passing by. He asked the cemetery janitor if he'd seen a woman at his mother's grave in recent days. The janitor replied that she had already left and was in the unfinished building across the street. Kevin took his car and went to see Imani in very bad conditions. He asked her to follow him home, but Imani refused completely. Kevin grabbed her and forced her into his car. He drove home with her. She told him that she could continue to work in the house and that he would continue to pay her, but that as soon as she gave birth, she would leave his house. After a few months, Elena, who had already planned to marry Kevin, came to visit Kevin at home. When she came through the gate, she saw Imani in the house, cleaning, and the detail that didn't escape her was that Imani was pregnant. She immediately went home to inform her father Patrick of what she had seen. Patrick immediately went to Kevin's house. He decided to ask Imani some more serious questions. How did you get pregnant while working here? Who's the father of your child? Answer me right away, or you'll be in big trouble. Imani plucked up her courage and answered her father, crying. You're the only one responsible for everything that's happened to me in my life. You're the one who sent me to sleep with a man so that I could be released from prison. This man made love to me without protecting himself, and I don't even know him. I didn't even see his face when he was making love to me. When Patrick heard this, a cold chill ran through his body. In fact, Kevin was the rich man he'd sent his daughter Imani to that night. So Kevin was the real author of this pregnancy, he told himself inwardly. He hurried home to explain the situation to his daughter Elena. Elena told him they had to get Kevin to marry her quickly before the truth came out. A few weeks later, Imani became dizzy and was immediately rushed to the nearest hospital. Once there, she went into labor and gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, whom she named Nathalie, as Madame Nathalie had wished before her death. When she came home and Kevin saw the child, he thought she was beautiful and couldn't stop looking at her. He quickly forgot the hatred he had for Imani, so much did he love the baby. He had a certain connection with her, but he couldn't understand it. Until then, he would never have imagined that she was actually his child. He loved the child so much that he showered him with love and affection and gave him many gifts. Imani was very sad. She told herself that her life wouldn't be the same if only she knew the father of her child. The next day, Elena visited Kevin to plan their wedding, when she noticed that Imani had already given birth to a baby girl. She felt uneasy, as her father had already informed her that the child belonged to Kevin. When Kevin saw her, he didn't have time to welcome her properly because he was playing with the child. He didn't pay much attention to Elena. He continued to play with the child and looked very happy. Elena, feeling embarrassed, left the house angry and sad at the same time, and went home with tears in her eyes. It was at this point that Kevin got into his car and drove to Elena's house to apologize for his lack of concentration. He arrived and parked his car outside, and just as he was about to knock on the door, he began to hear noises in the room. He put his ear to the door to hear what was going on. That's when he heard Elena crying hotly and accusing her parents. If Kevin ever found out he was the father of Imani's child, can you imagine what would happen? He'd probably decide to end our marriage. That would be a shame for me, said Elena. crying as Kevin heard everything at the door. He was surprised. Tons of questions began to cross his mind. Am I the father of Imani's children? But how is that possible? No, I don't think so. There must be some misunderstanding. His heart was beating so fast and he was sweating hotly. Elena continued crying and talking. Why did you send Imani that night, Dad? Couldn't you have found another girl? At least if you'd sent me, I'd be the actual mother of Kevin's child, Elena cried. Shocked by what he'd just heard, Kevin immediately got into his car to drive home. He couldn't drive properly, so mixed up were his feelings. He almost crashed several times. The disappointment of having used the innocent girl Imani that night to satisfy his needs. The joy of learning that he was the father of the girl he adored and cherished so much. The surprise when he discovered the true face of Patrick and his whole family. All his feelings were mixed up, and he was completely lost. When he arrived home, Kevin asked Imani to tell him the truth. What truth are you talking about? Asked a surprised Imani. Kevin continued. Since you've been in this house, I haven't seen you with any men, and since you gave birth, no men have come forward. Tell me the truth. You don't really know the man who got you pregnant. How is this possible? Then Imani spoke up and explained everything. When I was in prison, my father forced me to sleep with a rich man and promised me I'd get out of jail afterwards. Unfortunately, once the man had slept with me, my father didn't say anything about release until Madame Nathalie helped me get out of prison. The night the deed was done, the man who slept with me wouldn't let me see his face. We were in a dark room, and he deflected me without even knowing me or seeing me. I have never slept with a man in my life, and I had always promised myself to keep my virginity until marriage. But unfortunately, my father betrayed my trust. And today, I don't know the man who took my virginity and who is the father of my child. Now, can you explain to me the exact reason why you were in prison? Imani explained that it was her half-sister Elena who had been smoking and making a mess at a club, and that the police had arrested them, but that her father had bribed the police so that she would go to prison instead of Elena. When Kevin finished listening to everything the young woman had explained, he felt devastated and guilty. He was part of the reason for Imani's suffering. He went to bed in his room but couldn't sleep all night. The next day, without saying a word to Imani, Kevin took samples of the child's hair to the hospital for a DNA test. It turned out that the child was indeed his. He decided that the only way to put things right was to remarry Imani. He called Imani and asked her if she would marry him again. Imani immediately refused. She had enough problems of her own. Kevin insisted, but she continued to refuse. Kevin suddenly pulled her towards him and kissed her passionately. She couldn't resist him. She'd been in love with Kevin ever since he'd seen her in prison. But she didn't want any more trouble. Aware that she had promised Nathalie to marry Kevin, and completely charmed by that sweet kiss, she again accepted his proposal of marriage. Kevin organized a very grand wedding this time, one that truly defined him. Many great personalities were invited to the wedding. It was a beautiful ceremony. The following day, Elena and her father learned that Kevin had married Imani. They went to Kevin's house, all upset. Why did you cheat on my daughter? You're a manipulator, Kevin. Kevin replied, Me? A manipulator? What about you? First, you take advantage of this poor girl, and now you deny the promise you made to Elena to marry her. Let me inform you that I overheard the entire conversation you recently had with your daughter Elena. I was at your door, and I heard everything. I now know the truth. Now get out of my house." He ordered his guards to evict Elena and Patrick. The guards quickly complied. Imani was shocked by what she had just heard. "Daddy, is Kevin the same guy who slept with me the other night?" Imani asked confusedly. "Yes, it's him. He's a manipulator," replied Patrick before being thrown out by the guards. Imani was overwhelmed. "How could you keep something like this from me when you knew about it, Kevin? How could you keep something like this from me? It's my child. Can't you see that?" In anger, she gathered up her luggage and decided to leave the house. Kevin knelt down to beg her. "Please forgive me, Imani. I heard this news not long ago too. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid and I felt so guilty. I'm really sorry. I only found out recently because I overheard a discussion between your father and Elena where they were saying that I was the father of your child." Imani was at the end of her tears, but she was a girl with a heart of gold, and she decided to forgive Kevin for the sake of her child. Since that day, Kevin had changed a lot. He had become very attentive to Imani and took good care of her. This time, Imani really felt like a happy woman. She loved her husband, and her husband loved her. As for her father Patrick, he saw misery knocking at his door very quickly. His biggest company went bankrupt because Kevin, who owned the majority of shares, withdrew everything. Patrick saw all his assets collapse overnight, and at the end of his misery, with no other way out, he ended up working as a gardener for a lady in town. As for his daughter Elena, she ended up working as a maid in a bar. This was their punishment for all the evil they had done to Imani. Imani and Kevin lived happily away from the wickedness of Patrick and his family, under the divine and spiritual protection of Mum Nathalie. Never take away someone else's shine by thinking you can shine brighter, because karma will always end up working against you. Just be yourself. Live within your means. Don't try to destroy someone else's life just to make your own better. Tell me from which country you followed this story, and give me your impressions in the comments. Above all, leave me a like to help me grow my channel. It will only take you a few seconds, but it will help me grow my channel very quickly. I'm counting on your kindness.